Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 4th Annual Connections Online Wargaming Conference. On behalf of Brant Guillory, Zachary Grant, Merle Robinson, and myself, I'd like to thank you all for spending some time with us over the course of the next couple of days. I'd also like to thank the Armchair Dragoons for the essential support they provided in making this conference happen. So this is what I would like to call the least professional wargaming conference that there is. So what do I mean by that? The first part about that, the least professional part, is not that we do not have professionals here. What I mean by that is we don't really care about the production values. The important part is that we're having professionals coming and talking about wargaming topics, recording it, making it available on posterity, and having those conversations. That's the thing that I consider to be important. Also, that implies that we're all professional wargamers. What do I mean by professional wargamer? I don't mean necessarily that you get paid to be a wargamer. What I mean is that you're a dedicated wargame practitioner, or you think you might want to be. So those who care and study about wargaming, and those who do and who want to do wargaming, and everybody is welcome. So anybody who wants to attend can attend, ask questions, and I encourage you to do so. What do I mean by wargaming in this context? My definition of wargaming amongst my peers is famously loose. I don't necessarily think that when I talk about wargaming, I don't mean that there has to be an actual war involved. I don't mean war in terms of bullets and bombs and things like that. I mean war in the sense of conflict. I think that a war game has to be adversarial because that is what sort of gets people's juices flowing and gets them engaged in it. They have to be solving a problem, but it can't just be an engineering problem that you can solve through a spreadsheet. It's got to be something that's got a bit of an adversarial impact to it. So this year's theme is Distributed Wargaming Recent Lessons Learned. And this theme comes directly out of our collective experience with the COVID pandemic. As a professional wargamer, when COVID first hit, we ran into, I, amongst others, ran into the problem of how do I do my job in a world where I'm not allowed to leave my living room? How do we all do the job in a world where people aren't allowed to travel? Even if you can get a small group of people together, they can't get on an airplane and go someplace. That turned out to be, that was a big deal. And there was a bunch of initial thinking that took place by me and others like Pete Pellegrino, who's going to join me in discussing that this morning as sort of a scene setter. We had some in-depth conversations. We all worked the problem. We all came up with ideas. And then we went to implement them in practice. And then the pandemic is over eventually, a couple of years later. When I suggested this topic to my colleague, Stephen Downs Martin, Stephen's response was, everybody is so over COVID. Nobody wants to talk about this anymore. Pick something else. And my response to that was, Stephen, that's exactly why we have to cover this topic, because I'm afraid that people aren't writing stuff down. So we need to do a hot one. We need to do an after action report on wargaming in the COVID experience. And that's what I hope this conference is at least part of that solution. So with that in mind, Pete Pellegrino and I are going to do a little bit of scene setter because early on, we both recognized that we needed to do some, put some skull sweat into this. So let me turn it over to Pete so he can introduce himself. Pete?
Hey, thanks, Chris. Yeah, Pete Pellegrino. I'm a retired Navy flyboy, old prowler guy. They say that you're old when all the ships you flew off of are now artificial reefs and all your planes are on sticks or in museums, which pretty much so is me. Been at the War College, US Naval War College in the Wargaming department since 2004. And truth in advertising, I am a contractor mercenary at the War College, but I've been doing it, like I said, for 20 plus years. And a lot of times people forget that I actually am a mercenary there. So my background in wargaming really is a product of being at the Naval War College. And I say that because this is the whole where you stand is where you sit thing. That my perspectives on wargaming came out of that, profession, high end, if you will, big games. The War College routinely puts on games with right now 300-400 people is not uncommon for our larger games, and that shapes then how I think about this topic in terms of what's distributable, and what we did and didn't do very well during the pandemic as a result of that, and the various constraints that were on us, particularly from a classification point. I'll talk about that a little bit more. But then on top of my wargaming experience with the college, I blundered into some commercial side gaming, where I worked with some big toy companies in terms of just, again, as kind of well, I know how I do what I do. How do you do what you do? Because we keep telling ourselves there's a lot of commonality between the intellectual process of designing a war game, the intellectual process behind putting together a tabletop game for entertainment purposes, kind of the Hasbro Mattel world. And yeah, there is actually. And so I think later in the week, there's a discussion about your professional wargaming career and being a gamer. And it's not just, the skill set isn't so narrowly defined as what you do in wargaming per se, as it is just games in general. So again, I had some experience there. I also blundered into business wargaming, where businesses are really interested in using the gaming techniques to try to understand their competitors better. And then I found myself, and I still do quite a bit of gaming for kids in terms of education environments, gaming in schools, history simulations, and bringing it all together. So that's kind of my background. And this morning, Chris and I, again, we'll be kind of chatting about how did this all work or not work in terms of distributing gaming. And I'll be telling you a lot about what we didn't do. Okay, I'm kind of the anti, only because, and I will explain why here, by why my organization did not do a whole lot of this.
So very early on in the process, like I said, I sat down and started trying to figure out exactly what we were going to have to do to move stuff online. And actually, this conference is sort of part and parcel of that, because this conference is a spin out of the Connections Conference created by Matt Caffrey. And there was talk about moving the Connections Conference online. So the first thing I did, and I also do a lot of science fiction conventions, first thing I did was start thinking about how do you do a conference online? What are the parts of a conference, and what things do I need to replicate in an online environment in order to make a conference work? And so the next logical step after that is, okay, now that I've done that, what do I need to do to make a war game work online? And so I started working through the problem and started doing a lot of writing, et cetera. You're going to see some slides that are based on that writing, trying to define that problem. And then I discovered that Pete was working the same deal from his side, right? And I lost track at the War College when Pete and I were colleagues at the War College, because he started just a little bit before I did. I lost track of the number of times that I would walk into his office and said, "Hey, Pete, I've been thinking about such and such. We really need to do X, Y, Z." And he would pick up a notepad full of notes, because he's been thinking about the exact same problem. That we realized at approximately the same time that we had the same problem, we started working on the problem separately, which was a really good mechanism to sort of get the initial thought going, to sort of avoid, we didn't get on the same page right away, which I think was very productive. And then eventually we'd work through that. So I'm going to go ahead and the way we're going to do this is I put together some slides. These are slides that I created 3 years ago, with the exception of the conclusion slide. So this is sort of the initial take on it. And then at the end, I'll talk a little bit about, is that what happened? So let's try this. Okay, so all right, so this is like I said, slight revamping of a presentation I put together at the beginning. It was my initial thoughts on how we would go about doing this if we were going to try to do it. I've been wargaming since 1999. I've been a professional wargamer largely since 1999, although when I was at the Defense Intelligence Agency, I was technically not a wargamer, in that I was not in a wargaming billet, but I kept my oar in the water, continued to go to professional conferences, continued to lecture on the subject, et cetera, et cetera. I now I am in a professional wargaming job. I'm not going to tell you where, because if I do that, I have to talk to public affairs and do all sorts of paperwork, and I'm not interested in doing any of that. I'm here because COVID-19 forced us to think outside the box about designing and executing war games, and some of those techniques are perhaps still useful. We ran into some interesting limitations, and we had to think through the problem in a way that we don't usually have to think through it, and I think that that's a good thing. At the time, we had a lot of people just saying, we'll just do this online, and people like Pete and I were going because we understood that was a little bit harder than people thought. You have to go through and be very meticulous about going through and documenting all of your assumptions, including the things that you don't normally have to model, right? You have to model the things that you normally model, and you have to model the things that you don't model, because this is a little bit of foreshadowing. The amount of communication that takes place when two people stand over a map pretending to be their organizations was a really difficult thing to get around. It's hard to replicate that. That's why in-person wargaming is so powerful. That's why it's hard. One of the reasons why it's so powerful, and one of the reasons why it's difficult to do online. So what did we do about this? And let me emphasize, I am not speaking for this nameless employer. I'm not speaking for any of my other previous employers. I am speaking only for myself. I always tell people my hobbies are wargaming, science fiction, naval history, and not speaking for my employer. Those are my hobbies. Okay, so here's a basic outline. So I made the assumption when I did this originally, because of where I work, that I was mainly talking about classified events, and that they were primarily analytical events, not experiential, not training. It was primarily about generating data for further analysis. This makes the problem worse, but it's not essentially different. What do I mean by makes it worse? It means I got to deal with networks that have limited tools. It means that those tools, particularly in the form of video teleconferencing facilities, are high demand, low density assets. And while at my command, there is some chance that I, as the guy running the war game, might have priority access to some of these tools, I cannot say that about any of my players. And so those were issues we had to work into. Different users have different access to online resources. Some places, the local capabilities are quite robust. They've got lots of capability and capacity, and the priority to let them like block off a room for 3 days. But in other places, that isn't the case. And we have to take that into account when we're designing an online game, a distributed war game in that sort of environment. As a general rule, we're limited to two types of tools: Microsoft Office, or things that are available through a website. Because the ability to go and put something on a computer is pretty darn limited. If it's anything that has an install process that's more complicated than just dragging it to the desktop, you're pretty limited. JavaScript allows you to just drag stuff to the desktop. At least there's been some very interesting stuff that has been done in JavaScript, but you always run into the limitations of JavaScript in the end. One of the critical assumptions I made up front was that it can't just simply be an online version of an in-person design. And that gives us opportunities as well as limitations, right? Your environment is important. You need to take your environment into account, and you need to make your environment work for you. So while there's lots of limitations in all of this, I at least in theory, I'm not limited to a week, because nobody's going TDY. Nobody has to pay per diem or for a hotel or something like that. So in theory, at least, I could do a game that would be 1 day a week for 6 months. Now, there are other problems that run into that. So I don't want to make it sound like, oh yeah, problem solved. But what I'm saying is that it's a much different environment, and you need to adapt to that environment and look for opportunities to do things in a different, perhaps better way that take advantage of the environment. In all of that, we have to communicate with the stakeholders. Like if I went to, Joe Blow's boss and said, hey, I need him for 1 day a week for the next 6 months, right? If you send an invite that comes from your general or your admiral and it goes to their general or admiral, there's a certain imprimatur that comes along with it, and it's easy to pry people loose, or easier to pry people loose. It gets a little bit more difficult when Joe's still here. I can just go tag Joe as he sits at his terminal working on this game, right? If Joe's regular day job doesn't go away, then his day job is always going to be intruding. Communications with stakeholders to fence those people off is going to be key. And the tactics, techniques, and procedures are as important as the technology. Business rules matter in this regard. You have to be kind of anal retentive about writing all this stuff down and coming up with the procedures, rather than just say, go communicate online. That doesn't work. Okay. In person, we have manual games, we have computerized games, we have hybrid mixed games. Most DoD games, you have people physically co-located for up to a week or maybe two, depending. The battle rhythm is usually sculpted around the working day. What that generally means is you can either do one turn a day, which means that they don't get dinner, the adjudication cell doesn't get dinner, or you can do 2 turns a day, which means they don't get lunch either. And so it generally works out to 1 turn in the morning, 1 turn in the afternoon, or 1 turn for the day, because that's just the battle rhythm we generally end up with. The players come from a variety of sources. You might have small numbers from one place that provide critical subject matter expertise. It's not unusual to have a whole bunch of people that come from one organization and then little bits and pieces that come from other organizations. They're usually organized in multiple rooms by cells. So all the people that do, country X are in the country X room. And so it's good to have multiple rooms available. And you have to have some way to collect all that data. Everything I just talked about is something that you have to be able to replicate, at least at some level, in a distributed war game, right? You have to be able to segregate the players off from each other. You have to be able to collect the data that they're generating. That's a reason why you generally don't want to do this over phone calls, because phone calls are notoriously hard to collect data, even if you record them. I remember at the Naval War College, we had the ability to record people in the cells, and we did that once during the time I was there. And then we ended up with like 50 gigabytes worth of recordings and no time to go through them. And so the only times we ever recorded people, we sort of kept it in reserve. Like if we absolutely have to go track down something because we don't understand what happened, we got the recording. But as a general rule, we didn't look at them. Better these days with natural language models that can go in and sort of do transcripts and stuff like that. But even so, now, okay, that just gave you a transcript you have to go through, right? A lot easier to collect data sort of in stride and sort of do the processing in real time and then provide it to the analysts after the fact. Okay, barriers to distributed execution include a whole bunch of things that I've already talked about. You got limited facilities, limited tools. You've got lots of different communication needs, which get worse when you can't just have a bunch of people standing around a table talking to each other. There's no social acclimation between the players that you would have if you were in person. The way that these in-person games usually work is that you start off and then you go. It's sort of like going to the dance floor. You'd say, "Okay, start." And what generally happens is a lot of people just sort of go like, what do I do? And they just sort of stand around. But there's a few people that have been to these sorts of things in the past, or they're the jump in with both feet kind of people, and they start playing the game. And the people that don't know what they're doing sort of watch them for a little bit and go, okay, I'm going to do what Bob's doing. And then by the end of the first day, everybody sort of got it and everybody's gaming and stuff like that. And they're also getting to know each other, right? So they know, you can sort of pick out the personality types, et cetera, et cetera. All that stuff gets harder when it's distributed. There's a perception that there might be increased personnel costs. And to be honest, I don't remember. That came out of a specific conversation I had with somebody. And I don't remember what it was. I think it was just in terms of like having computers and stuff going on in the background. But to be honest, I don't remember what that was. There was a perception that there was going to be an extended schedule for completion, that it would drag on for a while. And so that can be either a feature or a bug if you decide to treat it that way. There's the idea of the inability to escape the day job. If I go someplace, my boss can't get me. Right? It's hard for my boss to get me. There's a barrier for my boss to call me up and say, I need you to do X. It's like, boss, my computer's back in home station. I can't do that. So you're just sort of gone. But if you're still sitting at your desk, right? If you're still available, there's always a temptation for the boss to come in and say, this is a higher priority. I need you to go do this. And so there's always when we've done stuff like this, we had to firewall the people off, and it was hard to firewall them off. A lot of it involved a senior flag officer on our chain of command sending an email to his senior flag officer saying, no, you need to tell your people to let them do this game. It's really important for the service. And then it's also, you've got the issue that you try to take a bunch of your analysis team in the form of data collectors and sort of spread them out in all the cells. Now you're in a situation where your analysis team is not with those people because those people aren't in a group. So how do you plug the analysis cell in with everybody else, right? And sort of related to that is the question of how do you make sure that you've got all the comm channels? If they're all locked in a room, you can see if they're talking. If they're not locked in the room, you can't necessarily see if they're talking. And the thing about gaming is that that sense of competitiveness is the real thing that sort of drives games, but it also leads players to, shall we say, do stuff off the books. And there are some players that if you give them the opportunity to like just call up, I know Bob and I work together all the time. Bob's at this command, I'm here. I'll just call up Bob and talk to him about the move in a mechanism that I'm not catching data on that. And so from the analytical side, that's problematic. I should emphasize though, none of these are showstoppers, right? None of these barriers to a distributed execution are any better or worse than the barriers to in-person execution. They're just different, and you have to acknowledge them going into the process. Okay, so mechanisms for overcoming these barriers. You can spread the game over a longer period of time, and so maybe that might actually even work to your favor from the standpoint that I couldn't get Bob for 2 weeks, but maybe if I just get him for a half day once a week for 3 months, maybe his boss will let me do that, right? Couldn't get him for 2 weeks, but I can get him for that. Asynchronous execution, you can make that work to your advantage. That way you don't have to create your game schedule in such a way that you don't have people twiddling their thumbs while the other people are preparing their move. A lot of game design, game scheduling, the practical aspects of the event planning is trying to make sure that players aren't sitting around being bored, not doing anything, right? So it's all about that. If I don't have to worry about that because Blue's going to do their turn on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Red's going to do their turn on Tuesday, Thursday, okay, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, whatever. If you're going to split it up like that and do it asynchronously, then you don't have to worry about one team twiddling their thumbs waiting for the other team to do their stuff. At least in theory, you can centralize the tools like through a website or something like that, which certainly makes it easier to get the data off of it afterwards. You don't have to necessarily go around to all the different rooms and collect individual bits of data there. You can break the game into smaller chunks, and you can do some processing in between those chunks, right? That's one of the things that always happens with a game these days. It's like, okay, I got a week. I got to plan out the entire week. It's really hard to call audibles. It's really hard to say, okay, how do we do this part? The closest I've ever seen professionally to doing that was something that Pete and I worked on called the Strategic Foundations game, where it was a meta game that involved multiple events of approximately a week. I think there was one that was just a couple days, but most of them were 1 week long events that we sort of did as a it was a meta game writ large. Basically, every workshop was one turn. And because of that, we could craft the next workshop to take into account what happened in the previous one. And we'd say, okay, this is an interesting problem. Let's drill down on that. But that was an all hands event that took us, 2 months to execute?
Yeah, that was a months long event. Yeah.
Yeah. It was a big deal. It was in many ways the coolest event that I've ever been part of, but it had some very interesting challenges associated with it. So what are the implications of this stuff? Potentially increased workload on the staff, right? Because if you got this thing going on, it's just this hanging chad that won't go away, and you're working on it for a long period of time. You could have increased manpower requirements that are part of this, or the other implication is that maybe you can do something that's better than the in-person games, because while you've got some barriers of your own for distributed execution, some of the barriers for the in-person games go away. Okay, last 2 slides. Observations, if not actual conclusions. So after discussing and observing distributed events, so this is the slide that I did after this all happened. Distributed online events, including war games, are different but the same, right? The idea here is that there are going to be differences. You have to design to your environment and as well as your objectives. And The differences aren't necessarily where you think they're going to be, so you have to think through the process. But in general, if you've got a good war game design process that understands the advantages and disadvantages of the environment, it may be a little bit more difficult from the standpoint that you're not just turning the crank on something you've done 1,000 times before, but those skills and techniques will serve you in good stead. Secondly, there's no magic bullet, but well-placed shots can be effective nonetheless. There's no like, oh, you get this software package and everything works. You get, Microsoft Teams will solve all of our problems. Discord will solve all of our problems. No, those technological solutions are not solutions per se. They are tools. They are part of the solution. But you can make this work, and you can take advantage of the advantages that you get from distributed wargaming, not just the disadvantages. So design for the venue, re-examine all of your assumptions. You got to be meticulous about putting all your assumptions in and run with it. Okay, so third thing, we need to set expectations with the players, their bosses, our sponsors, and ourselves. And so you got to change the narrative away from we'll just do this online. And that I think effectively happened very much so, because we sort of, everybody who tried to do this online, one of two things happened. They either said, oh yeah, this is way different than I thought, or that, which is what my institution did, or what Pete's institution did, they went, yeah, no, on second thought, we're not going to do that.
That's right.
So from that standpoint, you can't just say we'll do this online. That doesn't work. And we've got that message has gotten out to everybody. This trend towards centralized tools helps, but it's not a panacea. That was designed to solve the general problem of being able to install stuff on secret level computers. And so that's something that still needs to be solved. So the centralized tools aren't going away. And they will, the next time we have a global pandemic that shuts everything down, we will have a much better set of tools in order to make this happen, because those people are marching forth with those tools anyway. So the tactics, techniques, and procedures were critical. I predicted that was going to be the case because I'm a very process-oriented guy along those lines. So I kind of have that sort of hardwired into the first slide of every deck I do. And it turns out that it was true here. And I would start with defining your terms. And then the second thing I would say is you have to go back and make an assessment of what you're actually modeling with stuff, right? Two guys standing around a table models a communications mechanism, right? It represents this guy with his organization and this other guy with his organization, and they'll have a 5-minute long conversation that represents 2 weeks of emails and plans and meetings and stuff like that between the two organizations, right? And if you don't have a way to model that somehow, you're modeling it through the game in person, you got to be able to model that online as well and be able to capture the data from it if you need to. So, and that's what I put in the red box there. It's really about communications channels. You need to be anal retentive about documenting your communications channels, because if you don't write it down, if you don't document what your channel is, you can't replicate it. So we need to explore new tools to overcome the tools shortfalls. I like to say we're in the using airplanes to scout for battleships phase, right? Using airplanes to scout for battleships was really, really important. But I seem to recall that in the end, we came up with some other uses for airplanes in World War II that turned out to be kind of important. And so I don't think we've got all the answers on this yet. We need to work on it some more. And we still have critical shortfalls in capability and capacity, especially on the classified side. And the last thing is we should consider facilitating the creation of a best practices manual. Now, I think that maybe that manual might exist. I'm not done with it yet because I only discovered its appearance recently, but a NATO organization did a distributed wargaming best practices manual. I'm about halfway through it, and it's right. I'm about halfway through it, and at no point am I going like, oh, well, they missed this or they seem to be right on the money. And they had the right approach in terms like, okay, here's the problem, here's the advantages, here's the disadvantages, here's our recommendation, here's our best practice recommendations. So I'm sure there's probably some other ones out there. The CISA working group, you're going to hear from that in actually the next discussion here. You're going to hear from Charles Ternitza and Stephen Downs Martin talking about the CISA working group. Did some similar work to that. I think the NATO group was just fantastic, though. We need to avoid, though, what we really need to do is avoid the solution that the U.S. Army came up with after the president and the Secretary of Defense made them do counterinsurgency in Vietnam. Their solution was to say, we're just not going to do that anymore. And the thing is, they don't get to make that choice, right? And we're not going to get to make that choice about whether we just decide that we're not going to do distributed wargaming, right? At some point, my expectation is we're going to get told, wargaming is really, really important, and you need to figure out a way to execute. And especially if there's one of the periodic budget crunches that comes along, it's like, okay, if you can't execute on the war game, then maybe we just don't need your organization anymore, right? If you say you can't do a mission, there's a very good chance that you're going to be told your services are no longer required. So my solution to that is to be prepared, at least have a toolbox that I can use to do the mission if I need to do the mission. So that's the end of my presentation. So I guess first thing is, Pete, do you have any thoughts on what I just said?
So what you're going to see in my presentation is a lot of what Chris just went over, because again, Chris and I tend to be of the same mind in a lot of this. And I think probably the biggest driving difference was Chris's nameless organization pressed on and made more attempts at it. Mine didn't, basically. And I'll talk a little bit about why. But that said, because I've got feet in other wargaming camps, I'll talk about those experiences as well, where it did work, and maybe what the differences between the two were. But yeah, again, and I like Chris's ending analogy there in terms of the aircraft scouting for battleships, because the problem was that from our organizational perspective, the pandemic ended too soon, basically. All right. And that we didn't have to get out of we didn't have the time to let okay, so we're going to try to do things the way we did them in the past using battleships, but we got this new thing, planes, so let's muck around with them. And before we didn't have that time to be able to say, look, we're going to need to mature the aircraft part of this and push ourselves into kind of a new game space when, oh, look, things are ending, things are getting better. Looks like we can throw masks on. We're okay to get together in small groups. Why are we still talking about distributed? Type of thing. So, in some ways, it just ended too soon to really push my organization to look at what else can we use planes for besides just trying to do what we did before, scouting for battleships.
And we could really carry that analogy a long ways, because I think one of the things that people, brief little naval history sidebar here, one of the things I don't think people fully appreciate when talking about the naval aviation in the interwar period, there's this totally and completely wrong canard that the black shoe admirals and the brown shoe admirals sort of, that the black shoe admirals were dismissive of airplanes, et cetera, et cetera. That's simply not true. Everybody thought that airplanes were really important. Everybody thought that strikes from airplanes were really important. But there was a couple of things going on there that most people, that the professionals understood and the rest of the world didn't fully understand. First of all, airplanes weren't there yet, right? Really, the capability to do not just surprise attacks, right? There were surprise attacks in World War I, but you can't run an entire war based on nothing but I'm going to catch the other guy at anchor. So the quality of the airplanes necessary to do long range strike really only sort of happened about 1939, 1940. And so they had been doing exercises for a long time to try to get to that point, and they'd use surrogates, and everybody knew that the technology was going to get there, but it wasn't there yet. The other thing is that the Washington and London naval treaties really restricted the order of battle. So you only had a handful of carriers. If you've only got 4 carriers, you're not going to be talking about fighting a war using nothing but carriers, right? Because you have this entire battle line to do it. And so a lot of the carriers in support of the battle line stuff had a lot to do with, by treaty, we're limited to this. And so we have to fight the war with what we had. Now, the treaty went away, and by the time World War I came around, we were turning the crank pretty hard. And the stuff started, just as the war started, we started getting the flow of stuff coming out, right? The flow of stuff really sort of started in 40-41. And so if that war had started in 1943, I think the entire battleship versus aircraft carrier debate would have looked entirely different. So in any event, I had to get some naval history in there because I'm awake. So about this.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to put your slides up.
Go ahead. Yeah. And so I think it's always useful that actually starting with the first slide instead of the last slide, as Chris will back up.
Sorry.
There you go. Yep. Preview. Okay. So the part of the early discussions during the pandemic was everyone was saying distributed gaming. And it was like, I don't think that word means what you think it means kind of problem between different organizations. So as I thought deeply about it, and it was just taking scribbly notes on the side, because these were just internal conversations that we were having at the War College, I decided that, there's different things that are being distributed. And this was that first idea that where everyone tended to be thinking is the geographic distribution of the humans. All right. I said, well, that runs a scale. All right. So just to kind of go over the terms I kind of came up with, this idea of geographic separation ran the gambit from being geographically isolated. That means individuals were sitting by their lonesome at their own little computer, their own little workstations, and they had nobody else really around them. And that was the case. And all the players were like that. Right, so everyone's a complete geographic distribution, and I had games like that I did for the US Naval Sea Cadets, where each student was sitting in his own little bedroom with his laptop during the pandemic, completely isolated from everybody else. Then then kind of the middle step was kind of where I think a lot of organizations were trying to get to in distributed gaming, was this idea that we're not all going to be onesies, but we're not going to be all together either. So maybe a command has a space that we can put 5-6 people in, and they're kind of gaming as a cell, and those cells are all connected. So those are my clusters. And we started thinking about it from a geographic clusters perspective. And then finally, all the way to, hey, we're just all co-located, all right? Because even that, when we say, quote, co-located, again, with the War College, when I've got several hundred people playing a game, we're not in one room. So yes, we're on campus together. We're probably in the same building, maybe the 2 buildings across the street from one another, but we're more or less in the same place. And more importantly, we're in the same time. Okay, because that was the second piece of the distribution, which in the next slide here was this idea of time separation. And this is when I first brought this up. I got a lot of people going, we didn't think about time. They just assumed synchronous, that the only thing that was going to be distributed were the humans in geography. Otherwise, we're going to do things like we normally do, which at the college is synchronous play. So this idea that you could have an asynchronous environment where people were in different time zones, not all on the game at the same time, was a bit of why would we do that part of thing? Because again, it went against the norm that we had developed over decades of gaming. So asynchronicity has a lot of advantage to it. And again, and Chris has already touched on some of those, and the idea that you don't have to have everybody on at the same time. You can do the whole, hey, I just need your stuff by Tuesday kind of thing. And we'll take it from there. Somebody typically had to be online, though, in terms of that central control, which then became a bit of a challenge in terms of the idea of thinking, hey, we're going to be playing across multiple time zones, but somebody's got to be the hub. Someone's got to be control. And you're going to basically start to turn into a 24/7 unless you can really have complete standalone activity going that you don't need to be Big Brother monitoring the activity. And that's true in some organizations. They've been set up like that at NWDC, Naval Warfare Development Center, and their 360 activities in terms of, hey, we turn the package over to the staff. They've got a set of deliverables they got to create, and they've got a timeline to create it in, and they just send it back. It's sort of like the email equivalent of the old play-by-mail games, right? In terms of you have a complete package, which you can work on at remote station and then send in. And that's going to be something that in terms of one of the lessons learned from all of this is the quality of your documentation or any products that you're going to send downstream has to be airtight. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second. So, and then you can see time slowly slides towards being synchronized, right? Staggered times. And we did this with some student gaming where we said, hey, bulk of your stuff has to be due on Tuesday, But there are a couple of points, check-in points during the week where everyone's going to be online. We can get a check-in. You can do some synchronous play, but then we're going to slide off and again back to get your stuff in by Friday. We'll get an output. And now obviously synchronous is we're all in the same time zone altogether. So those are the two big distribution parts of it. The idea of how we're distributed in time and space. But then the tool suite became something that we had to think about. And Chris has mentioned this as well. And this is the next kind of depiction here. Is this idea about what networks you're working on it from a classification perspective. So the next slide here kind of shows that distribution of, hey, when you're working on class, odds are people can find a space to work from. Once you start to go to super secret squirrel, then those spaces, the size of that space, the number of those spaces dramatically drops off. And this is where we ran into the biggest problem. All right, from a world where we have gotten comfortable with gaming with hundreds of people at the TS level. All right, so at top secret and in special programs, when you're gaming at those levels, the number of spaces and facilities that are certified to work at that level are precious few compared to, hey, let's all just jump on the internet and fire up Zoom or some other distribution tool to be able to communicate together with. And this was probably the single biggest stumbling block that we could not get past in terms of the college's gaming and the sorts of customers we have and the different fleet sponsors and whatnot and what they wanted to game at. There has been a little bit of I'll call it an artificial inflation problem with classification in at least our gaming experiences, where it used to be when McCarty Little Hall, the Naval War College, was opened up in 1999, the idea was, hey, the building was designed to game to secret. And if we had to, we can get special permissions to do these temporary secure working areas and we can go up to top secret. But how often do we have to do that? All right, this is again, how much memory can your computer possibly need? Okay, a megabyte. Oh my God, who ever need more than that kind of thing? So it became from, we were doing a lot of secret gaming, occasionally some unclassed stuff, but not a whole lot. And then likewise, occasionally some TS to now, if your game doesn't have all sorts of long alphabet soup for classification, your game isn't cool. It's not taken seriously. And really, what was the point? So even though your topic, as we're sitting there going, well, this topic, I think we can discuss at the secret level and still get a lot of good value out of it. It doesn't have that cachet of, well, what was your game? Oh, you had a TS game. Oh, did you have special programs? No, we did. So, and it's just twofold. And it's not just the ego part of it. It is the idea that increasingly we seem to think that there's some special technology which is tucked away under a special classification program that is the war-winning strategy, the war-winning widget. And if I can't play with that widget, then I'm not accurately reflecting how the fight's really going to go. So there's a lot of issues and problems with that from an intellectual perspective in terms of the utility of wargaming. But be that as it may, when now I need to have everybody into a JWIC space, or they need to be in a SCIF, which in some commands is that small closet with one computer behind an ops center, and I'm trying to game with hundreds of people, that's just not going to work. So this was probably the single biggest constraint that we had on the War College jumping in with both feet, was we just couldn't square the classification problem with the capacity problem.
So
then,
if I could
please
jump in for just a second, because I realized I didn't, and you haven't articulated something that is painfully obvious to us, but isn't necessarily to everybody else, which is when we do a secret level game, we're not using the secret internet to do that. We're not using SIPRNet to do that. We've got our own standalone secret network that exists only in that facility. And so that's why we don't have a capacity problem when we're doing an in-person game. Everybody can have a secret computer, but that secret computer isn't connected to anybody else. When we start talking about doing something distributed at the secret or top secret level or whatever, now now all that stuff's irrelevant. That stuff, for all practical purposes, doesn't exist. We're limited to the places where you actually have terminals that get onto that secret network. So McCarty Little Hall at the Naval War College can have 400 gamers in it, all with a secret terminal if they need to have. The Sipper Cafe, at least when I was there, the Sipper Cafe down in the basement could seat what, 10?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Right. Again, and this is also part of the thing that we talk about this idea that as soon as you leave the confines of your own facility, where I control 100% of the server, the bandwidth, the resources, I've got my own IT people, I got my own web developers, I got all that. It is self-contained. As soon as I go and I pierce the skin and I go out into the wild world, I'm now relying on other people's systems and other people's IT and other people's support. Type of thing. And this is where, again, we potentially ran into problems. Just try to run a TS video teleconference where the scheduling requirements, how come we're all looking at each other and I'm not getting any audio? Well, whose problem is it? Is it my end, your end? Is it somewhere in the middle? I don't know. When it's in my building, I know who to go to fix it. But as soon as we go distributed into these networks, these are systems that aren't used to being exercised like this.
Yeah, and we shouldn't underemphasize the crappiness of the bandwidth also. So like if you want to do, at one point we were trying to do something that involved like basically just feeding a computer monitor screen to people that were in another time zone. And we eventually decided that that wasn't going to work because everything was so blurry. The bandwidth was so limited that you couldn't. It's not like being on the internet. It's like being on the internet circa 1998, right? Where everybody's just blurry all the time, et cetera, et cetera. And so even if you had the number of terminals, you don't have the pipes.
Yeah. And so then what's riding over those pipes, the next slide here, in terms of, and again, Chris has mentioned this, in terms of what exactly are you using for software to support? And this tends to be, when we get into distributed discussions, people spend a lot of time, and you're going to have to spend a lot of time thinking about the technology and that enables the distribution in the first place. However, there's a whole human dynamic design problem in terms of what you're trying to do. But everyone seems to think that, we just need to fix this part of it. We just need to whip up, we just need a better software package and it'll fix all the problems. You still have the issues that Chris has already mentioned in terms of the way humans interact, right? And what it is you're trying to collect and what it is you're trying to do. And when you're trying to simply go from, I know how we did it before, lots of people in a building standing around charts, and then communicating through an internal network to pass orders back and forth that some sort of adjudication team is going to adjudicate and push answers back out. We just need to, quote, replicate that in the wild and everything will be fine. Again, that's the whole just go online and everything will be fine. If your experience, most of your gaming experience has been relatively small scale in single room environments, or maybe you're separating red from blue, then you probably can see your way into that environment more easily, especially if you had any experience with online tabletop environments, right? Vassal, Tabletoptopia. If that's kind of your experience and you're already used to going from playing OWS or Assassin's Mace or some sort of board game environment, then there's already kind of a pathway that's been well trod by the gaming community, not with a W in front of it, all right, just plain old gaming community, that you kind of see yourself that, hey, I can see the transition. But that's provided that your current experience kind of aligns with that. When your current experience is hundreds of players, days-long games, giant moves, a lot of coordination between the moves, and then you just say, go online, that wasn't going to work terribly well without a lot of other thought. And least of all, your problem is just this whole productivity package. Okay, DoD is terrible at having the up-to-date, latest, coolest, greatest software available on these secure networks. We're still working with Office 97 2003, okay, on a lot of our networks, which is just killing me. And part of it is there's problems with the software industry and the way they distribute updates now, and the issue about cloud updates and what I'm connected to or not connected to. But understanding the tools you have to work with and the limitations those tools are going to impose on you, again, was a big part of, we can't find a quote unquote solution that allows us to do the sorts of things we were doing before. And this is probably the single biggest step you've got to take, is without enough time to mature the activities and the people involved with them. I've got a bunch of people who are still stuck in lots of people in the building model. Therefore, distributed gaming has to replicate the lots of people in the building model, just quote distributed. We're not going into it saying, hey, let's purposely design for distributed activities. Those things that I've done with that in mind have actually worked pretty well for other audiences where I do a ship Age of Sail frigates battle game that I play with a class at the Naval Academy. I'm in Newport, they're in Annapolis, works great. Similarly, I've done, now that's kind of a cluster model. I'm the oddball. I'm the guy who's distributed, but everybody else is in that classroom. Likewise, I've done stuff for Sea Cadets where they're scattered across the country in isolation. But again, I designed a specific activity for that, worked great. So those were examples where, yeah, you can do it. I mean, you've got a design to it and you need to understand their implications. But for the big DoD giant analytic games, there's quite a bit of a mental shift and effort that has to happen to get you to that point. So and that's probably the single reason why the War College leads didn't go jumping in from a big analytic game. We're still having conversations. As a matter of fact, I had someone reach out to me from our distance education folks that there's still, I think, a lot of opportunity space from that perspective and how to bring the benefits of when you're on campus and you get to do some gaming in the classroom. How do we do that for our distributed education environment? But again, we're talking about a different mindset, a different sight picture than when people just wanted to somehow go from, I wanted to be able to take what's happening in McCarty Little Hall and just put on goggles and have it happen distributed. Why is that hard? Isn't there AI to do this? Can't we all just be avatars? But no, it's not quite that easy. And it's the technology is a challenge, but it's a lot of policy and a lot of senior officer expectation for what the game is supposed to be doing for you, type of thing. So the last couple, yeah, Chris.
I was going to say, one of those expectations you have to get across to people is that you're going to have failures. There's a game that I will not mention. I was not directly involved with it at all, but some of my coworkers were part of it, where like nothing went right. Right, they were trying to do it online. The turns ended up running 3 times as long as they thought they were going to. They basically crushed the software they were going to use. Now there were some other problems there, but you know, when push comes to shove, when people would complain about this, I'd say, hey, they're trying. This is great. This is great, right? You know, their approach didn't work, and so make a note of that and do it differently next time. But I'll give them a lot of credit for the fact that they said, I mean, they put an awful lot of work into trying to do something in this situation, and I will give them. I'm always in favor of trying and failing in situations like that than to just say it's too hard, we're not going to do it.
Yeah.
So
yeah, this is the last little part. I'll just stick out there because I don't know if Merle's got some questions that came up through the YouTube chat side. But this idea that part of it is the more your gaming is of a nature that you're really interested in the products being produced, then you can kind of go to that play by mail. Distributed environments, asynchronous, people working on their own or working at distant headquarters and sending stuff in type of thing. The more you're interested in how the sausage is made. So if you just want sausage, there's lots of ways that people can do sausage in a distributed environment that'll probably be just fine if in the end you're just interested in the sausage itself. At the other end of the spectrum, though, is if you want to watch sausage being made, and that is what you're interested in, is how the humans interact, how decisions were made, then now you're going to run into more challenges that you're probably pushing towards more of that synchronicity you need, that co-location type stuff. Doesn't mean you can't do it distributed, but understand that there are strengths and weaknesses of both systems, right? And again, Chris has already kind of touched on this, features versus bugs. There are strengths and weaknesses to being face-to-face in a big game. There are strengths and weaknesses to being distributed. And it's not just like that you can just throw a switch. They go, what am I feeling on today? And which one do I want to do? No, it's very conscious decisions. And you need to understand the cost benefits going into those things. And just be really upfront especially with your sponsors and what you're going to get out of it and the backside. And if in the end you decide that I can't get what I need for the purposes of my O plans, my con plans, again, from the professional side of the house, then Roger, then maybe we're not doing a game this year. Maybe we're waiting it out. Maybe we're having to do something smaller when we can get together. But until then, what are we going to do? So we'll stop with that one. Yeah, I mean, this is just, and again, if you've seen the stuff we did like in 2020 for connections, this is the idea that all the games that we've done, I can map on this whole idea of isolation to co-located, asynchronous to synchronous, to unclassified networks, to special networks and dedicated tools and systems, that all of these games, quote, could be somehow plotted on here. And this is the idea that's why when we say a war game and distributed, we mean a whole different smash up. Because war game means a lot of different things to different people. Distributed means a lot of different things to different people. And trying to marry all those up is why oftentimes I think people had unrealistic expectations for what could be done or were unwilling to try, because again, we couldn't get our heads around we couldn't get our heads into the same space to understand what was in the realm of the possible. And if it didn't look like what I did during the non-pandemic, then why am I doing something like this during the pandemic? Can't we just wait it out? This will go away. How long can it possibly last? Kind of thing. Other groups said, hey, I think this is an opportunity to push forward.
And I love this slide. This is just such a great summary of everything you said.
Yeah. And as Chris said, all right, this idea of trying to pull together, again, it's all pros and cons. You just have to go into it. And probably the biggest thing you have from our perspective is, if you're going to go down a distributed pathway and you haven't been down this journey before, you need to start far earlier than you think you do to get ready for that game. So this is the whole, you don't decide 2 weeks out, maybe we should do this distributed. All right. You should have decided that, 6 months out and designed to it.
Now, that having been said, the power of gaming, depending upon the scale of your problem, you might be able to do something faster than you might think if the number of players is slow enough and you don't have to worry about order of battle and stuff like that, like course of analysis, wargaming stuff. Don Marin and I once designed a game for Pack Fleet literally on Sunday afternoon that they executed on Monday morning. Now, I am not saying that you only need a day. I'm saying that if you are willing to if you've got the right problem, the right players, and you're willing to deal with the constraints, gaming is a very powerful tool, and you can pull something together at the last moment, or you can pull a matrix together.
And part of that success, and this is something that, again, I don't want to throw everyone over the age of 45 that's currently serving under the bus, but my work with students at the Naval Academy and other gaming organizations that are going after the 20-somethings, I'm looking to, this is going to, pay off in the long terms in terms of sponsor willingness to do this as a function of, again, what the sponsor's experience has been. And when all their sponsor knows is big classified games, it's very difficult to get them to wrap their heads around something that could potentially be smaller or lower classification and distributed, yet still be useful. I've got ensigns now who are thinking about this, that hopefully by the time they get to do those ranks, it's going to be a much lower mental barrier to entry.
Okay, so we don't really have time for any questions. That's the bad news. The good news is Pete and I are going to be in the next panel. That's a distributed wargaming panel. We're going to bring in some other people we wanted to do the scene setter here. And so what I recommend to anybody is go to the other, if you've got a question that you did not yet articulate, go to the other panel and put the question in there. And that's a 2-hour-long slot. We should have time to do it. So thank you very much, everybody, for attending the first session of Connections Online. And we're going to go ahead and call it. And any second now, I'm going to stop talking, and then the producer is going to put up the slide, and we're going to go away. So thank you very much, everybody. See you later.
Thank you. Right.